The ongoing violence in Sudan, despite diplomatic efforts, has resulted in thousands of deaths and displacement of millions. Meanwhile, in Darfur, home to a quarter of Sudan's population, witnesses recount some of the worst fighting, including mass civilian deaths and ethnically motivated assassinations blamed at the Rapid Support Forces, which it blatantly denies. The International Criminal Court is now investigating potential war crimes, including sexual violence and targeting civilians based on ethnicity. This will be our focus on today's edition of One Slot. I am Rita Amodia. Do stay with us. War crimes characterized by intentional killing of civilians, torture, destruction of property, sexual violence and other grave violations persist in various regions of Africa. Notable instances include the Rwandan genocide, ethnic violence in Burundi, the Amhara genocide, and the war in Darfur. Despite the historical recognition and prohibition of such behaviors in armed conflict, they continue to plague these areas. In response to the escalating violence in Sudan, the International Criminal Court, ICC, has launched a new investigation into alleged war crimes. The ICC's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, presented a report to the UN Security Council emphasizing the 3 months of warfare between conflicting generals that have once again thrown Sudan into chaos. The ICC has been actively investigating crimes committed in Sudan's Darfur region since 2005, following a referral by the UN Security Council. Former leader Omar Al-Bashir already faces charges, including genocide, from the Hague-based court. With increasing reports of atrocities during the recent conflict, the United Nations has called for accountability from the warring factions. Concerns have been raised regarding the potential for new massacres in Darfur, with reports indicating that the bodies of at least 87 people allegedly killed by the Rapid Support Forces RSF and their allies have been buried in a mass grave within the region. Join us in this first half to examine the war crimes allegations of Sudan and the role of the ICC is Ovigwe Eguegu. Is a policy analyst, development reimagined. He joins us from Istanbul, Turkey. Thank you so much for joining us on One Slot.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So we go straight into those recent allegations, and the International Criminal Court has opened a new probe into alleged war crimes in Sudan. So tell us, how is the International Criminal Court approaching its investigation into these war crimes, and what exactly are your thoughts on these allegations?
Yes, it is very important that the international community does not ignore what we've seen in Sudan in the past 3 months, because of course we know for a fact that even though the peace process has broken down, that's the one in Jeddah, there's really no headway. That does not mean that the conflict is not escalating. So it's not solvable. It is solvable, right? But in the meantime, while we're looking for alternative ways to solve it, I think we need to be very cautious of how the conflict is playing out. And in recent months, we've started seeing a repeat of what we saw in the mid-2000s in Darfur with the Janjaweed, which is almost like a precursor for the RSF today. So these crimes of crimes against humanity, of sexual violence against women, and extrajudicial killing and all of that, it's very troublesome. And the UN has been sounding the alarm for some time now. And then, of course, we saw that the formal investigation have begun. I think it's going to be very difficult at this point for the ICC to be able to send people on the ground to do proper investigations across the country, and particularly regions where these reports are coming from, because the conflict is still ongoing. And I think how they are going to navigate that is a question that needs to be answered.
You would agree with me that these are very damning allegations of people being massacred, sexual violence in the midst of an armed conflict. And this is not the first time we're seeing such allegations. So can you provide more information on previous investigations into war crimes in Darfur? Were there any significant findings during the previous investigations?
Of course, they were, yes. So if you go back, it was June, particularly in June 2005, that the ICC opened investigation into war crimes, crimes against humanity, you know, and genocide in Darfur committed by Janjaweed under the then leader Omar Al-Bashir, who was then indicted, and the ICC did issue a warrant for his arrest. He of course he wasn't really arrested until the coup deposed him from office and he was put in prison. Even that process is still ongoing because he was supposed to be in prison, and the Sudanese government under Burhan was still discussing if they should hand him over, to the ICC. However, now with the issue of the RSF and RSF not becoming the RSF transitioned from the Janjaweed, I think this is something some scholars and experts have been talking about when this conflict started. Some people made the case that the Sudanese army should just incorporate the RSF. They are reformed. The Arrow is not just rapid support force, but also Arrow also should be seen as a reformed military formation, and that should be incorporated into the army. But the Sudanese armed forces, led by Burhan, was still very much concerned about the RSF because it's not a proper professionalized army. Now we have a conflict, and again we're seeing them act the same very unprofessionalized manner and causing all sort of problems and acting in a very damaging way to the conscience of the Sudanese people. So what we're seeing with this investigation only adds to the issues around credibility of the RSF, and it's going to be very difficult for them to make a case for themselves, particularly the leader Hemeti Dahalo, to say he can lead Sudanese people or whatever his ambitions are. These investigations and the alleged crimes committed under his leadership of the RSF only worsens his bargaining power with regards to ending this conflict.
Now, let's go back a bit to Omar Al-Bashir. I mean, you mentioned him, and when you talk about the Darfur genocide or the war in Sudan, that name really comes to mind. And just like you rightly said, he was first given a warrant of arrest and was issued on the 4th of March 2009. We had the second one on 12th of July 2010. But Ovigwe, he is still at large, along with other suspects, for example, Ahmed Haroun. So what exactly have been the challenges to apprehend Omar Al-Bashir?
Yes, so the ICC can issue arrest warrants, but they don't really have a mechanism that is independent to prosecute or to execute the arrest warrant. They have to rely on member states, so member states of the Rome Statute, which establishes the International Criminal Court. So, for instance, you could remember there was an incident where Omar Al-Bashir attended the African Union meeting in South Africa. And there was the expectation that the South African government, being a signatory of the Rome Statute and a member of the ICC, would then arrest Omar Al-Bashir. But the government then under Jacob Zuma, South Africa, refused, and he went back to Sudan. So when we see this sort of ICC, a warrant issued, you can't really you can't really be hopeful of arrest if the leader doesn't leave his country, because even though he leaves his country to go overseas, it has to be in a country that is a member of the Rome Statute, and that government executes it. And also, it was a standing precedent. So there's also a case of state immunity or sovereign immunity, and that's also complicating even the issues with President Putin as well. So it is unlikely at this point that this investigation will be concluded, because, like I said, the war is still ongoing. Al-Bashir is still at large, and other members of his regime that were very, very much implicated in the Darfur genocide. Even the leader of the RSF currently is not free from these from these allegations. Now, this is already happening again under his watch. So it's a very dicey situation, and it's very unfortunate that we're seeing a repeat of history, a very dark and bloody history, on the continent.
Now, you mentioned a very valid point, the fact that Sudan is not a signatory to the ICC or the Rome Statute, and we're seeing these investigations that are starting on the war crimes going on in Darfur, Sudan. So what are the guarantees that this investigation will become fruitful if the previous ones, we look at Omar Al-Bashir, who is at large, you also talk about even the RSF leader, Emeti. Is the ICC really going to have important or relevant or significant investigations now?
Yes. See, when we're talking about issues of crimes against humanity, war crime, genocide, I think overall we have to understand there are people behind these stories, and they need to be part of the process in the sense that this investigation needs to be concluded and the perpetrators identified, regardless of the fact that they could be prosecuted, they could not be prosecuted. That is a different matter. Let us know if these crimes were really committed, with the scale to which the crimes were committed, who were the people in charge, who gave the orders to these troops. And we know there is a framework for accountability in the ICC, right? But first of all, it is imperative that the investigations are conducted. Then we can deal with the political and diplomatic challenges. But for now, in the Sudan context, given that the war is still ongoing, I think that would be very challenging. And this could turn out in two ways. One, it could compel the RSF to clean up his act. If you look at the RSF very carefully, particularly Hemeti himself, he has really tried to launder his image, to create an image of a potential leader of Sudan. He is able to transition the country to democracy. His messaging and platform has really been built around him trying to do away with coup plotters like Bohan, and try to bring back democracy and transition. So for someone who is speaking the niceties of democracy, I think such an allegation against the forces that he commands puts him under a lot of pressure, because now it's tainting an image, or at least it's making it difficult for him to build a new image of a credible leader. So these investigations, in that sense, could compel him to then get his men under control. However, crimes have already been committed allegedly. So if he's going to show himself project himself as a credible leader, then he should be cooperative with the ICC to ensure that these investigations are actually done in a manner that the ICC investigators don't feel coerced or even the investigation process tampered with.
Now, what exactly are the steps to ensure that relevant parties or communities are able to go online with this investigation? Look at the witnesses, the survivors, the war crimes. How can they be protected during the process of investigation?
Yeah, so there is a new mechanism to discuss peace in Sudan that the Egyptians are leading. I think that could really be a potential, I would say, process that we can then plug in this issue into. I don't know if both parties will be open to the ICC investigation being part of those talks, or at least giving leeway to the investigators to move from territory to territory protected. And it will be very important if the Egyptian process can actually incorporate these findings into it, because that platform would very likely to lead into results, since the talks in Jeddah have completely collapsed. So what would be very good if the African Union and African Union, IGAD, and all of the countries, the four parties really involved in the Sudanese process, in Sudan peace talks in Egypt, if they can agree to put these accusations within that framework and say, for now, one of the easy wins we can achieve in this whole peace process is to at least allow for investigations to go on, right? And both the SAF and the RSF can agree to that. Then this will be a huge step. But I'm not so hopeful, because I think if you look at the record of the RSF, the likelihood that they did commit these crimes is very, very high. And if that's the case, then they want to stall the process. So if you then include the ICC issue into the talks in Egypt, I think those talks might not lead to any fruitful outcome.
Now, this war crimes happening in Darfur, Sudan is just a case study. We have also witnessed severe incidences of war crimes. Look at Ethiopia, Tigray, Amhara region. There have been cases of reports, allegations of war crimes. So what measures do you believe should be considered or implemented to hold these people responsible for war crimes accountable and also prevent war crimes from happening?
Oh yeah, this is a conversation security experts and analysts and even scholars have been dealing with for many years now. I can even say for decades. War is very ugly, and these things tend to happen. That is just the reality of it. There is a provision in the UN even with the Rome Statute. The African Union itself has its own provisions to prevent these things from happening. But they always happen. Because and that's really why it is very important to prevent war in the first place, because when the first shot is fired and we're in all-out war, you can't really control how people act, anymore. And the crimes that they commit make the war even more and more intractable, or the conflict intractable. So from my perspective, I think preventing genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity starts by preventing war in the first place. Because if you don't have the war, then the likelihood of these crimes happening is much reduced. But in the context where war is somewhat of a part of the human experience and international and state relations and politics, then what we can then do is to be more proactive in trying to resolve conflict before they become wars, and that's one. Then two, even when we fail to do that and we have wars on our hand, the early warning mechanisms have to be very, very perceptive, so that we know as soon as possible when this thing starts to happen. And I must give some credit to the ICC in this regard, and the UN's system in this regard, because if you look at the numbers that are reporting, they're saying about 87 people, right, have been killed. That is low. Not to take away the fact every life matters, but that is low compared to what we've seen in Darfur before. Before we started seeing the reports and investigations, we're way past this number. So I think in a way that at such a number, we're already seeing very, very decisive measures being taken to investigate. I think that's progress. But like I said, it's one too many, right? So I think the professionalization of militaries is a very key component when we're trying to prevent war crimes and crimes against humanity. And it's no surprise that it is the RSF, which is not a professionalized army in any way, that are being implicated, in these allegations.
Now, contrary to your commendations on the International Criminal Court, we've also had people who have been condemning the International Criminal Court, saying that it's not been efficient or effective enough, saying it has also been biased. There's also been a clamor for, instead of going to the international scene, let's look at an African criminal court. I wonder what your thoughts are on this.
Of course, the International Criminal Court has a very questionable history. I mean, who were the people who caused all of the massacres in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Libya? Those countries and their leaders are walking free. One of the big criticisms against the International Criminal Court is that it is only African cases that tend to get the sort of attention and prosecution, right? And cases we've seen in other parts of the world, particularly in cases where Western countries are involved, those are always swept under the carpet. So that's a major issue that needs to be addressed. So the double standard is an issue. However, let's not forget, the double standard does not mean that these crimes are not happening. Once a crime against humanity is a crime against humanity, it doesn't matter who commits it, right? So even if we're going to condemn the ICC's record and bias, we also then have to solve that problem of preventing war crimes and crimes against humanity through a mechanism that we believe, it's actually credible or more credible. And if you recall, Hissène Habré, the former leader of Chad, for instance, he was actually prosecuted with an African system, right? And Hissène Habré it's one special case, but I think it's a case that all of the continent of that was a pioneering case that I think we need to build upon. But that was a West African mechanism. ECOWAS is quite good in this area. So maybe if the African Union kind of set up an international criminal justice system or crime system, maybe we can then put that out in the RECs, because the RECs tend to be more agile and flexible, smaller number of countries, and they can easily just resolve the issues at the level of the RECs, just like we saw with Habre.
Let's go back to efforts from the regional community in ending this war. I mean, they're all leaders. They all sit at the same table when they go for meetings. For example, the African Union. In your own assessment, how have regional bodies, I mean, you also talked about what's going on in Egypt. That's the peace dialogue to bring about peace in Sudan. But for other regions, what has been your assessment of regional organizations, other African leaders in stabilizing communities with more reference to Sudan and tackling the root causes of the conflict?
Yes, it's always important. I mean, the continent has made significant progress in silencing the guns. I mean, that is actually an AU initiative to silence the gun by 2020. Of course, we missed the targets. There are many reasons for that. We can go into that another time. But I think it is obvious to the African leadership that conflict and war has to be a thing of the past. Of course, we might not avoid conflicts, but you need to avoid violence, right? And we have to create mechanisms to prevent conflict, and if you get conflict, prevent this conflict from turning into violence. And the African Union has really been pushing on creating an early warning mechanism. We have, the African Standby Force. We have even regional mechanisms as well, ad hoc joint task force in Central Africa, in Western Africa, and so on and so forth. So the ideas and the initiatives are there, but some of the challenges, for instance, is actually in terms of financing these initiatives, and we're seeing that even in West Africa as we speak. We have to take our security more seriously on the continent. I think that's something that is imperative. There is no part of the world where the UN provides the security, or we have to rely on the UN system, not in Europe, not in Latin America, not in Asia, nowhere really. So it is the leaders of the region who have the contextual understanding of what their problems are. They need to be the one that develop these mechanisms based on their own realities and context, and then and finance it. But that's a problem. So Africa is creating the initiatives and the mechanisms for these issues, but not doing enough of the financing. So we need to go into that, because that is really where the challenge is. The ICC has been one of the immediate past lead prosecutor was from the Gambia, Bensouda. So if Africans can lead the ICC, then Africans can actually lead their own ICC, right? So that's what we should be moving towards, and we could then have so-called African solutions to African problems.
All right, now, Ovigwe, still looking at African solutions to African problems. I mean, looking at these communities with more reference to Darfur now, we have local communities where these atrocities have been committed. So how can they be actively engaged or involved in the investigations?
Yes, of course, that is definitely imperative that when the investigation starts, people are given a safe and comfortable environment to give their testimonies, and that really is a very key part in ensuring that this whole process is fair. Again, I go back to the Hissène Habré trial. They created a very safe mechanism for those who were terrorized under Hissène Habré to actually give their testimonies, and this is because he was no longer in power, right? Now, if you want to investigate the situation in Sudan today, you first have to answer the question of the RSF and the SCF. So you have to address the war, because if the leaders still have power, they would stifle the process. So the process, the legal process most likely can only take place after we've resolved the conflict we have in our hands today. But in the meantime, what we can do that doesn't require any form of peace settlement is gathering of evidence. And that is what is really crucial right now. I think before we start seeing unmarked graves and a lot of confusion as to where someone was buried, someone was not buried, families disappearing, people fleeing the conflict that have credible information to contribute. I think now is the time for proper investigation to start, getting all of the records, getting all of the witness testimonies, so that when we get to the point where this conflict is resolved, then trials can begin, and there will be a whole body of evidence to support the trial process.
Now, as much as we want to look for African solutions to African problems, we cannot erase the role of the international community. And somehow we see them also financing some of these militias. I mean, there have been several allegations on it. So what role does the international community play in bringing about peace and, successful investigations towards in this conflict?
Yeah, I think one of the first things it needs to do is the so-called international community has to work under real international framework. For instance, this ICC investigation went through the UN system, and that's a very laudable approach. Rather than countries slamming Sudan and leaders with unilateral sanctions, it needs to be through the UN system, right? But they can't stop there. They can provide expertise. They can provide some form of experience sharing, but the real work has to be done through both international organizations like the UN and African institutions as well, like the African Union, IGAD, because we already have these mechanisms, present. So the challenge we always see in Africa is when some conflicts in some part of the country, in the continent, are seen as too complex for Africans to resolve. Libya was a very good example, where African Union and African leaders were essentially shut out of the process in resolving the conflict in Libya. The AU chairman, Musa Faki Mahamat, was actually traveling to Germany to hold talks about his continent, his continent in another continent, which that is just ridiculous, right? So even the conflict in Sudan, for instance, the first peace talk efforts was taking place in Jeddah, outside of the continent, right? We can't solve problems in Africa abroad. They have to be solved here, and they are conducive. There are countries that are conducive and appropriate to have these peace negotiations. The same way we have experts and in law and criminal investigations that can put together all of the body of law and processes to establish a prosecution for investigation and prosecution for war crimes. So international support is needed on the continent, but that should not be done in a way that really robs African countries of their not legitimacy, but also sovereignty and agency.
Now, Ovigwe, it seems as if militias are quite afraid of the international community. You earlier talked about the fact that sanctions may not necessarily be the most appropriate way. But when you hear sanctions from the international community, it seems like everyone just tightens their belt. So, first of all, I would like your take on the sanctions, how effective they have been in curbing all this conflict, and sponsors of the war crimes.
I would say they've generally been very ineffective. Maybe threat of sanctions have led some of the parties to agree to peace deals, but you see what happens. They agree to ceasefires, to ceasefires, 72 hours, 1 week, whatever. But they keep breaking those ceasefires rather. And that is not surprising, because the situation on the ground is much tougher than what negotiators in Jeddah, had at the back of their minds. This is a do or die affair for the RSF or the SF. Nobody thinks one party is going to come out of it, completely unscathed, not even unscathed, even existing, right? So that it's such a heated and it's a real power struggle, and that has made this very complicated. So you could sanction these leaders, but the leaders themselves, if they know that this is a do or die affair, then sanctions really mean nothing, because if they lose, they're finished anyway. So that's why this has been very complicated. And I think with the Egyptian process, Egypt has a very deep understanding of Sudan. The relationship is good with the state. I don't know how independent the Egyptians are, because they have very close ties with Burundi. But it's possible that something can come out of that, even if it's just more humanitarian agreements, other agreements to ease the humanitarian burden of the people of Sudan.
Thank you so much, Ovigwe. We can only hope that something fruitful comes out and there's peace brought back to the people of Sudan. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation. And it's not over until it's over. We'll continue until peace is restored in Sudan. Thank you once again for joining us on One Slot.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're still watching One Slot right here on News Central Television. We're looking at the ICC investigations into alleged war crimes in Sudan. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, the conversation continues.